AV so that we can hear our esteemed panelists online and also connect to the more than 300 people who registered online to watch it from afar.
John, can you speak?
Yes, can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes, I can hear you.
You can hear me, yeah. Somebody else, Alex, has said he wants to hear me, but anyway, we're unmuted, both of us.
Okay.
Sean, can you hear me? Yeah. Just try calling. You need to just try calling. Hey. No, that monitor is not projecting sound. It should be. Check, check, check. Can you hear me? I don't know why. This is different.
Yeah.
I don't know what's happening.
Check, check, check.
Yeah, I got them on. Okay. Yeah.
No.
Well, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I could hear them here, but I don't know if they can hear us.
They're not responding.
Yeah.
John, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, you can hear me. Can you talk?
Sure. Can you hear me? I'm
All right,
I'm
we're
not
halfway
muted.
there. We're halfway there. Any rumors that this is interference? We can just read.
Can you try logging out and logging back in?
His audio isn't too
I can hear him.
Oh, you
I don't know
can.
why it's not coming through.
All right. Seems she's loaded.
Can you hear me? Can you talk, John, for a second?
Yes, can you hear me now?
There we go.
You get to graduate early. Come see me later. Come see me later. Yeah.
You guys can John and Oksana please talk? Say something?
Yes, can you hear me?
Oh no, forget that.
John, can you say something?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Okay, now you have to leave.
Can you dial in to this? It was going fine until you stepped in.
We got to make a decision here.
Your phone, you
Yeah.
hold your phone next to my.
Microphone, that's it.
All right, we're gonna start. Yeah.
So first.
Keep it up there. Yeah, there.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, we're going to at least start having a conversation in this room, and hopefully our colleagues in IT will be able to get this working as it was earlier this afternoon. I apologise for the delay, and I apologise in particular to Oxana and John, and hope that they'll be able to join us in a few moments. So to those of you who are online, welcome to the Fletcher School, welcome to the ASEAN Auditorium. Tonight's event is hosted by the school, but also by the Fletcher Russia and Eurasia Program, and I'm very grateful to Chris Miller, to Dan Drezner, and to, of course, Eric Brokowski for all of their sterling work over all of the academic year, but in the last few weeks, what has been a particularly tumultuous time. I'm very grateful to Professor Ian Johnstone for moderating tonight's panel.
Hi, how are you?
How lucky we are to be able
I can
to
hear
call on
everybody, but I
him
guess
at
they
a
can't
time
hear
like
us.
this. And to Dan Drezner, Professor of International
Yes, I can
Politics, to
listen, yeah.
Monica Toft, Professor of International Politics and Director of the Centre for Strategic Studies, and to John Shattuck, a Professor of Practice and Diplomacy, if he will be able to join us over the wires. And we're very pleased to be able to have Tufts Associate Professor of
If you
Political
want to,
Science,
let me
Oxana
telephone
Shevel,
numbers
with us to
how
participate in
would
tonight's
they-
discussion. In addition to her role at Tufts, Professor Shevel also serves as the president of the American Association for Ukrainian Studies and is an associate at Harvard Davis Center for Russia and Eurasian Studies and its Ukrainian Research Institute. 2 weeks ago, punditry, maybe more in hope than in anything else, brushed away the idea that a full military invasion was on its way. Illegal weapons ran down on the historic cities of Ukraine, and the idea of it seemed preposterous to most Europeans and maybe to most other people around the world. 10 days ago, who would have thought the Germans would have exited Nord Stream, especially a traffic light government? Who thought the Swiss would abandon neutrality? Who thought that in the General Assembly, Russia would only be able to get 4 countries to support it in the General Assembly vote? Who thought that Kenya would run around the United Nations with an extraordinary statement of against anti-imperial aggression? Who would have thought BP and Shell would have divested their Russian assets, or at least declared that they intend to? Who would have thought that MasterCard and Visa would be out? Who would have thought that Maersk would be now operating outside of Russian ports? And who would have thought that FIFA even FIFA would have come to something like senses. The International Rescue Committee, that has no operation in Ukraine, really didn't quite know what to do at the end of last week. UNHCR started talking about 4 million people, mainly women and children, coming over the border. The EU scrambled to enact its ability to absorb these populations. And the tremendous suffering of Afghanistan, the extraordinary famines of Yemen and of the Horn of Africa are pushed to the back pages of the newspaper as we all focus on what is happening in Ukraine. So it is our job at Fletcher to interrogate, understand, interpret from every angle, leave no stone unturned in our understanding, and hope that in these conversations we can be part of a conversation that can turn the world back towards peace and find justice. Clearly, when international law is thrown to the side so violently as has been in the last week, that's no mean feat, but this is a place that all of us would like to be to discuss it. And so I hand over to you, Ian. Thank you very much, and I hope and pray that the IT will deliver for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean Kite. Welcome, everybody. I won't make any introductions for the panelists. I think you know them all. Dean Kite just gave you the headlines for each. We'll begin, I think, with the panelists here, and then turn to those on the screen, and we'll try to figure out how we can somehow get them connected to us. I've asked everybody to be really brief in their introductory remarks, 5 minutes. Terribly unfair given what there is to discuss. But the idea is to have introductory remarks by the 4 panelists. I'm going to say a few words about international law. I might ask a follow-up question or two, and then we will open the floor to questions from both people in this room and on Zoom. So with that, I'd like to ask Monica to begin. Monica?
Sure, thanks, Ian, and thank you everybody for coming. And I'm actually saddened that we're here in this room for this, under these circumstances. You know, I joined the Army some 40 years ago as a Russian linguist fighting the Soviet Union. And here I am 4 decades later, talking about the nightmare that I was deployed to try to prevent. And, you know, Ukraine, you know, I've been there, friends there, I've been to Russia many times. And so this was deeply distressing for me, and I'm not even there personally. And I can only imagine for my Ukrainian friends and my Russian friends as well. So I'm just going to run quickly through 10 points. I'm a New Yorker, I talk fast, but I promise I will try to stay within the limit. So I have 10 points. The first point is I'm a student of nationalism, a student of the former Soviet states, the Russian Empire and the Russian Federation. And this is an imperial project for Putin, who personally viewed the demise of the Soviet Union as one of the 20th century's worst catastrophes. Those are his words. And he personally viewed that from East Germany. Putin has been a smart strategist, and so far he has not lost any altercations that he has entered, from Chechnya in 1999, Georgia in 2008, Crimea, Donbass, and Luhansk in 2014, and Syria in 2015. This is a man who's not used to losing. You need to be careful. However, this invasion is a big one at NATO's doorstep, and importantly, it doesn't seem to be receding as Putin and his generals anticipated. Ukrainians didn't greet them with open arms or lay down their arms. Furthermore, this invasion has demonstrated that the Russian military is not as formidable as Putin and his generals would like to project for us to believe. Coordination of air and ground assets is lacking. Where is the Russian Air Force? Where is it? And may explain the nuclear threat, a sign of weakness and a worrying one in that it came so early in this war. Putin is a hyper-nationalist and does seem to believe that Ukraine and Belarus and parts of other pieces of Europe, if you read his July screed and listened to him last Monday, are part and parcel of Russia. And by the way, so do many Russians. Emotions and attachments to land and nationalism matter here, and not deny this. Just because Putin's a thug and a bully, we all agree that, doesn't mean he doesn't believe that parts of Ukraine should be united with parts of Russia for nationalist historical reasons that he has devised in his tortured imagination. But he has told us this for some time, we just were not listening. The West is partly to blame. for not listening. 3 points. It refused to listen despite numerous protestations when NATO was being enlarged, especially after the 2008 Bucharest Summit Declaration, which declared that Georgia and Ukraine will become part of NATO. George Kennan, perhaps the most knowledgeable student of Russian identity and interest, warned about expanding NATO in the 1990s before its death. Add to this the expansion of the EU, which would bring liberal ideas to the region, which for any autocrat constitutes a threat. And he's now a personalistic dictator, we know that. Moreover, we can't forget that Russia has been devastated by invasions in the past. History matters. In France in 1812, Germany in 1941, and oh, by the way, invaded by the United States during the Russian Revolution. This matters. These ideas resonate in Russia and for Putin. For the West at this point, sadly to say, Ukraine is not considered a vital strategic interest. It's an interest, but not a vital one, that would justify the deployment and possible death of its young men and women. Therefore, at this point, any help will be in the form of weapons, funding, diplomatic, and moral support. However, the winds are blowing, and I think Dean Kite outlined some of them, and Ukraine's fortitude in the face of Putin's blatant disregard for human life is responsible for that. President Zelensky is playing a very bad hand incredibly well, both diplomatically and military terms. What is so different this time around is that most of the global community, and not just the West, is backing Ukraine. Moreover, Putin's actions have led to an incredibly fast change in the European security architecture, from uniting NATO, causing Germany to rearm and abandon the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, to the rethinking of neutrality by Finland, Switzerland, and Sweden. Great power politics is alive and well. China is watching this debacle with some trepidation and perhaps delight, don't know yet, as the US and West becomes further entangled and distracted from China's power and rise. 9, we need diplomacy. We are the Fletcher School of War and Diplomacy. Putin is a weak and insecure man, but he is a leader of a country with thermonuclear weapons. We need to stop the killing and the destruction, even if this means that we need to back away or temporarily shelve Ukraine's admission into NATO and into the EU. We should accept that for a time, I'm not saying permanently, that Ukraine may have to serve as a buffer state, but one that we can help to provide economically and be there diplomatically. Great power politics still matter. We are not in the 19th century or even the early part of the 20th century. It is shocking in the 21st century that we're back there. Lastly, my last point, Putin will not last forever. He'd like to. He'd like to stay in power to 2036, he's guaranteed that. And perhaps, just perhaps, the Russians will engage in another revolution, hopefully not bloody. We've already seen enough blood loss to toss out his current leadership. Thanks.
Thank you, Monica. Dan?
Thank you, Ian. While I'm sad we're all here, I do have to say, I think this is the largest collection of students I've seen in a single room in 2 years. And I'm very thankful for that. It's nice to see you all. And not on the screen. So I don't apologize for that. So I suppose I should talk about the sanctions and what the implications are of the sanctions imposed against Russia. And I think part of this has to do with what the purpose of sanctions, what is the reason why we were sanctioning Russia? And there's a couple of reasons. The most obvious one is we said we were going to do this. Biden administration was extremely clear that if Russia were to move into Ukraine, it would face incredibly punishing sanctions. You don't make that threat and then not follow through. Credibility counts in international politics. And so there's a reason why you want to impose sanctions when you say you're going to impose sanctions. And here I would say that the Biden administration gets considerable credit in terms of laying the groundwork for not just imposing sanctions on its own, but rather coordinating with allies, not just in Europe, but also countries like Japan, Singapore have also agreed to the sanctions, which is in some ways extraordinary. If you have Switzerland, as Dean Kite said, Switzerland agreeing to sanction Russia, I mean, you have to do something really bad against Swiss, to actually take a position on something. So that's genuinely extraordinary. And there's a way in which the sanctions themselves also are a signal to Russia of exactly how unified, you can argue, the rest of the world is in terms of its response. So that's one purpose, that's another purpose. A third purpose is to inflict economic pain on Russia. And this is explicitly what the statement was by the United States and European Union when they announced the sanctions. The goal, they literally said, inflict pain. And well, mission accomplished it, because these sanctions are incredibly punishing. And it's hard to understate that. The move to freeze Russia's central bank reserves that are held overseas means that it can't really defend the ruble. We've seen the ruble plummet by far more than it did in 2014. You know, the fact that you've seen, you know, not just that, but also inflation go up. Ordinary Russians literally not being able to get their currency out. Ordinary Russians not being able to travel outside of Russia at this point because Russian airplanes can't land anywhere. Not only that, if this, and this points to something else, which is, it's not just the official sanctions that are an issue. It's also the degree to which private corporations basically said, okay, we are on board with this as well. So as a result, you have Boeing and Airbus announcing they are not going to service Russian aircraft at this point. And that's what a lot of, you know, Russian civilian aircraft is, either Boeing or Airbus, which means they'll be able to fly for a little bit, but it's, you know, with each passing, you know, month, there's going to be more planes that are not going to be able to fly. You have energy companies who for decades were willing to do business in Russia, deciding, no, we're not going to do this anymore. And indeed, in response, you've also got Russia saying, well, you can't get out anyway, we're going to nationalize your property. So in some ways, that is also a signal of the degree to which Russia is going to face economic pain in a way that makes 2014 look like a mild cold. And this is a much more severe issue. Now, that said, however, it is worth pointing out that the question you have to ask with these sanctions are threefold. The first is, how does this affect the global economy? The second is, how does this affect Russia? And the third is, how does this end? So when you talk about affecting the global economy, there are a lot of concerns about, well, this will cause energy prices to skyrocket, it will cause inflation to go up. I'm less concerned about those things. The sanctions were carefully tailored to make sure that Russian energy could actually continue to flow into Europe. So that's not that big of a deal. What is more of a big deal is food. Russia and Ukraine combined are responsible for more than 25% of all wheat exports. They produce a lot of maize, a lot of rapeseed oil, and so on and so forth. That will no longer be able to be exported. And that means you're going to see skyrocketing food prices in places like Egypt and elsewhere. If you recall, that was one of the triggers for the Arab Spring. And so there's going to be knock-on effects that we can't anticipate. The second thing is, what does this do to ordinary Russians? And what does this do to Putin's standing within Russia? And I do think you are seeing for the first time, people actually, like strategic thinkers actually beginning to wonder, is this the end of Putin? In other words, he's caused so much economic, you know, this has caused so much economic pain within Russia. You've seen ordinary Russians bravely going into St. Petersburg or into Moscow and protesting. We now see, you know, prisons, I think, are at full capacity in those cities. That said, you are dealing with a leader who has managed to stay in power for more than a generation. And it would be foolishly optimistic to assume that this is going to be the thing that tips, you know, him over. Which then leads to the last extremely important question. How do these sanctions end? Because the longer this goes on, there are two things that are going to be true. The first is that ordinary Russians are going to bear the brunt of the economic pain. Ordinary Russians who have played no role whatsoever necessarily in Vladimir Putin deciding to invade Ukraine. And it is possible that those sanctions, rather than alienating those Russians from Putin, will actually cause them to rally behind Putin's flag. And that is a reality that has to be considered. The second thing, and this is what I'll close with, is basically what does the future of the global economy look like? Which is, if these sanctions continue to persist, you are basically talking about a new Cold War, which is not something I have said for the last 30 years or 40 years, because I found it largely wildly exaggerated. But you were talking about economically segmenting Russia away from the rest of the global economy, in essence. It goes back to the same kind of Cold War economic relationship. And then the question in that sense is, if you eliminate Russia's interdependence on the rest of the world, to what extent does Russia have any equity in making sure that the rest of the world actually functions? And then what choices do they make then? And so the thing I want to see with these sanctions is what has to be done for them to end? What has to be done what are the terms that have to be met for them to end? And if they're going to persist, how do you impose a strategic embargo and something more considerable on Russia without, hurting its ordinary citizens? And I'll close with that.
Thank you, Dan.
I'd like to try something real quick.
Okay,
John, can you talk? Can you say something?
Can you hear me?
you do have a backup plan. You
I'm gonna have you talking to your phone.
Sure.
Let's ask, all right, John, you gonna take it?
Can you hear me now?
Have you got the same arrangement with Oxana as well? Yeah.
I'm having difficulty hearing you.
John?
I'd be happy to speak now. Are you asking me to speak now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, let me be brief. And given the complexities of the communication here, I'm not sure that it's going to work very well. Let me just say a few words about the point.
John is talking now. Do you want me to talk now or wait until he's done?
First, Putin's goals. What are Putin's goals?
Okay.
We thought a week ago that his goal was to secure eastern Ukraine, Donbass area. But clearly, after a week of violence and war, this is all of these after. I think he's got two big goals, and we should make sure that we understand those. One, is, the biggest of all, is to rewrite the rules of international order in that sense. And in that regard, rewrite the way in which the Cold War, the post-Cold War world has been shaped. But he really is, through these actions, rejecting a law-based order for a power-based order through the use of force. And in that sense, he's trying to create the kind of world that Thucydides talked about when he said the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Now, I want to pause at this moment and agree with Monica that indeed, I do think that the U.S. bears some responsibility for this very world that we're talking about because of the intervention in Iraq, which did indeed, in many respects, challenge the rules-based order. And one could say that the intervention in Kosovo, in which I was very directly involved, also becomes something of a challenge for the West. So the U.S. is not completely innocent in this regard, in Putin's first goal. The second goal, which I regard as even more dangerous, is he wants to essentially push back democracy and prevent the expansion of democracy. He's not just interested in trying to keep Ukraine from becoming a NATO member, but he's actually trying to undermine, and has been doing so for a number of years, democracy in the West, in the US, certainly, and in Europe, and he's trying to destroy it in Ukraine as a way of making it clear that the authoritarian approach is going to be a wave of the future. So these are the two big goals that he has. His narrative in pursuing these goals, we have to understand that too. I think Monica's sort of referred to a bit of it. One is that Russia was humiliated by the West after the end of the Cold War, as it danced, as he put it, danced on the grave of the Soviet Union. This is not true. There were many efforts to assist Russia from the West, massive amounts of funding that was provided. But in any event, that's the first point in his narrative. The second point is that the US broke its commitment not to expand US and Europe, not to expand NATO. This is a very complex subject, and there was never any formal commitment made. And in fact, there's a great deal of scholarship now on this subject, which demonstrate that there was never a formal commitment. But there may have been an understanding in that respect that NATO would not expand. The third aspect of his narrative is that Ukraine is historically part of Russia, that it's basically the control of the sphere of influence in the Russian neighborhood is something that has long been accepted within the broader frame of Russian history. This too is a deeply flawed, but nonetheless contentious issue and assertion, which I think many, certainly all Ukrainians or most Ukrainians would contest, but nonetheless, it's very much made. The final point that he makes in his narrative is that his intervention in Ukraine is really comparable to the interventions in Kosovo, Iraq, and even Afghanistan that the West made, and therefore is fully justified within that interpretation of a rules-based order. Each of those interventions, I think, can be sharply distinguished from what's going on in Ukraine, particularly the intervention in Kosovo. But nothing, even if we accept that some of these interventions are somewhat comparable, nothing justifies Putin's massive violence and the kind of jeopardy that he's putting the entire civilian nation of Ukraine in by making this military intervention. So those are Putin's goals, and those are Putin's claims for why he's pursuing these goals. The stakes for Ukraine and the world, which is my second point, and I won't go on at much length after that, is that if Putin is able to succeed in these goals, we will see basically an end of sovereignty as we've come to know it as the basis of global order. We'll see a militarization of international relations. The use of force will be accepted. Again, one could argue that the US has contributed to this in recent history. And above all, and most disturbing, we'll see a strengthening of authoritarianism and the destruction of Ukraine. So I think the response that the West has mounted, and I won't go on at any length on this, Dan Drezner has done a very eloquent job of telling us about the sanctions and the impact of the sanctions. But I think above all, what the response to Putin has had to be and has been is to demonstrate that he is severely miscalculated. He's miscalculated by underestimating, above all, the courage of the Ukrainian people and the massive resistance that they're seeming to show, and certainly their unwillingness to accept anything like Russian sovereignty over Ukraine. He's underestimated Western unity and strength, as both of the previous speakers have pointed out. I would just add, as a kind of humorous footnote, that even the small kingdom of Monaco, which is seen to be a haven for all the oligarchs, has basically shut off their access to their resources and funds in that small place. So, I think he's underestimated the impact of the massive impact of sanctions. Now, I want to make one point here about what Biden's top priority, what the top Western priority should be, having said that almost all of the equities, shall we say, are against Putin at this stage. But I think Putin is perhaps unhinged, but certainly uncontrollable and very much isolated. And I think Biden's top priority has to be to avoid nuclear war. I mean, nuclear war is a real possibility under these circumstances. And I think communicating with Putin and avoiding triggering any kind of incident, avoiding Putin's trap, that there might be such an incident that's pursued, I think that is really critically important. So let me then ask the question, when and how does this end? And just to put forth four relatively obvious scenarios, none of them terribly attractive, although one of them, the first one, the most optimistic, is that Ukrainian resistance, bolstered by outside military and sanctions support, actually forces Russia to withdraw because the cost becomes too high, both on the ground in Ukraine and certainly in terms of the economic sanctions. The second scenario would be some kind of negotiated settlement in which Russia perhaps manages to occupy Ukraine, but can't stop the Ukrainian resistance and the Western sanctions, and perhaps Russia becomes interested in some kind of negotiated settlement. And here I would put in China as a critical factor, because I think China, the interests of China and the interests of Russia are not completely coincident here. China doesn't like global economic turmoil. And China, in fact, is expected by Putin to back him up, I think, certainly economically. But if China decides that they want to see this thing end, China has more leverage than almost any other possible actor on Putin. So how does that?
Ian, it's Ian, the moderator speaking. Can I just ask you to wrap up really quickly? So
yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm just about done. So, the third scenario is Russia controls Ukraine through heavy military operations. That may be in the future, and we have a new Iron Curtain at the Ukrainian border. And the fourth scenario, which is devastating, would be some kind of NATO-Russia war, which we want to avoid under all circumstances. So I think these are the stakes, and this is the problem. I think the early activities over the last week show the extent of Putin's miscalculation, and they certainly are early signs that he isn't succeeding. I think the early casualty estimates, which the Pentagon estimates at approximately 2,000 Russian soldiers killed in just 1 week, and Ukraine says even higher, indicates, again, a very heavy price that Putin is paying at this point. So let me end at that, and thank you. I'm sorry for this communication complexity, and I hope I've been understood. Thank you.
Thank you, John. We understood you really well. Oksana, it's over to you.
Can people hear me or not? Janina, do you want me to speak into the phone? Can people hear me now? Yes? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, thank you. Okay, well, thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel. A lot was said already, so I will shorten some of the things I was going to say. Before I say anything on the topic, I just wanted to make a statement. I'm calling hereby on the Fletcher School and Tufts University to sever its cooperation, its institutional cooperation with MGIMO, the institute under the auspices of the Russian Foreign Ministry, which has been justifying this war. I think it's completely morally unacceptable. Yes, there are people in that institute who have spoken against the war, and those people by all means should be welcome and encouraged, but I think as an institutional cooperation, I think it's morally unacceptable, so I'll just leave it at that. Now, on the topic of our conversation here, I would like to sort of first maybe say a little bit more on the misunderstanding of Ukraine that Putin has, and I would say to actually just hearing the commentary before, I think some in the West have as well. This idea that somehow what happened in Ukraine was about NATO expansion, I certainly hope we don't need to prove that it wasn't, because Putin makes it very clear the very fact of sovereign Ukraine on his border is unacceptable. So Ukraine is simultaneously a mortal threat to Russia, supposedly, because NATO is going to put ballistic missiles in provincial airports or whatever nonsense that he was saying in his speech. Ukraine, as we all know, was not going to be a member in NATO. There was no support for that within NATO up until 2014. There was no support for it in Ukraine. There's consensus is necessary, so all of this. So that's, I think important to keep in mind when we're talking about sort of Putin's rationale. Yes, he has his rationale, but I think his rationale is quite different from the rationale of many of us here. Now, the subject of Ukrainian resistance, I think not only obviously that, many of you admire it, and of course, it's also not something that Putin expected, because he expected basically Ukraine to be quote unquote liberated from its Nazi government, as he describes it. That's not what we see happening. I think that greatly affects what kind of scenarios we are going to see, or we can sort of say going forward. And I'm actually not very optimistic here because I really only see two scenarios. I think one scenario is that Putin wins, and that would mean not some sort of buffer state, as some I think Dan was saying previously, or Monica, I can't remember who was saying that's possibility. It won't be a buffer state. It would be a wasteland with concentration camps. That's what it's going to be. So I want everybody to be very clear that I don't think there is any kind of negotiated settlement, some sort of buffer state. If Putin wins, and again, we've seen that in the intelligence reports, that, you know, there are killer lists. The denazification does not just involve decapitating Ukrainian government. It involves eliminating academia, people who work on things such as the famine, right, on the Second World War, on memory politics, anything that disagrees with Putin's view of Soviet past as this glorious period that cannot be criticized in any way. Everybody is in danger. And Ukraine will fight, and millions of people will die, probably, or hundreds of thousands. There will be tens of millions of refugees in Europe. So that's sort of the buffer, quote unquote, buffer state scenario. There won't be a buffer state, there would be a wasteland. Another option is that Putin somehow loses. I think this is something that we can discuss maybe in a greater extent in the Q&A. I personally see it as there are multiple moving pieces. You know, the sanctions that were mentioned, indeed unprecedented and pretty devastating in Russia. They have started various processes. I would agree that I think some sort of popular overthrow of Putin is unlikely. But I think it is worth thinking what would possible consequences and processes in Russia will be. Earlier today, I read an article by a Russian sociologist who was, himself arrested in the protest, and he's actually talking about possibility of Russia introducing martial law and mobilizing, basically closing the border and forcing people to fight this war if this war doesn't go Putin's way. I don't think that's a fantastic scenario. So there is still other things that, say that haven't been done sanctions-wise that could be considered. Yes, of course, NATO doesn't want to get involved with like boots on the ground. I'll get to that point in a minute. But say there could be additional economic measures taken. I think, again, depending what the West can stomach, if Putin keeps bombing Ukrainian civilians in the cities, is putting embargo, for example, oil and gas embargo on Russia that Ukrainian government has been calling for. Yes, it's very costly, but if on the other side of the scale is the lives of hundreds of thousands of people who are being fired at right? Is that going to be something that will be discussed? So what I wanted to say that I think it's worth thinking what might happen in Russia. I'm now actually having a bad echo from myself and the video and the audio in the auditorium. I don't know if it's the same for other people on Zoom. I hear myself twice, it echoes. Okay, now it's better. Anyways, I'll continue. Hopefully you can hear me. I think another thing to think about what is the thinking process in Western capitals, right? As I said, on the one hand, troops on the ground is out of the question. What else might be done? Like would sending planes, for example, right, crosses some sort of red line. We don't know what would trigger potential nuclear war. Of course, that's something the West wants to avoid, understandably so. But being that Putin is not really rational in the way that we are talking about, right? He already threatened foreign countries. He already concocted this completely fantastic scenarios, right? Like we can say that sending Stinger and the Gaza missiles to Ukraine, that's already military aid, right? We don't know where that line is. And I think this is something the Western governments should be really thinking about. And maybe the last point that I'll make, I think, as you probably some of you know, that Ukrainian government applied for EU membership. And I think actually Ukrainian state proved itself to be much more resilient, Ukrainian people to prove themselves to be, really quite impressive, right? So it's sort of this argument now that Ukraine does not deserve to be in the European Union, and whoever thinks that this is somehow will trigger, Putin to get angrier further. I mean, we already see what he's doing, right? I think this is something that will be on the agenda. I think and I think it should be on the agenda. I think the message that Ukraine has obviously not like membership tomorrow, but actually starts negotiations for membership in the European Union would be great moral boost, I think, for Ukrainian defenders. And I certainly hope that this is something that the Western governments are considering. So maybe I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oxana and John, for overcoming the technological obstacles. We can hear you very clearly, and thank you for those remarks. I want to say a few words about the international law here, but just, Oxana, just thank you for your opening appeal regarding Ngimo and the relationship between Fletcher and Ngimo. I think, as everybody knows, we do have a relationship, and it's one where students and faculty could exchange views and dialogue and whatnot. So my understanding, I don't speak for the school, my understanding is that that will continue for the time being. But there is it's going to be constantly under consideration and under review. And in the meantime, our dean has been in touch with the dean of Indiana, called for a cessation of hostilities, and hopes that message gets delivered in that sense. But the relationship is under review and will continue to be under review. So thank you for bringing that up. I'm going to spend literally 2 minutes on some headlines with respect to the international legal issues. And if you want some elaboration, I'd be happy to try to answer questions. And I see some of my colleagues in the back of the room, they might be able to help me if I can't answer them. But it's at least the legality or the illegality of this is very straightforward. There's virtually no question that this is a clear, unequivocal violation of international law. Article 2.4 of the UN Charter prohibits the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. That happened. There are some exceptions to that prohibition. None of those exceptions apply. The original speech that President Putin gave, he listed some of these. One of them was self-defense, individual self-defense. Doesn't fly because Ukraine was not attacking Russia. Another was collective self-defense on behalf of the Luhansk and Donetsk republics. That doesn't fly because those are states that can't invite collective self-defense. They're not states, even though they were declared to be by President Putin. President Putin claimed that there was a genocide and that humanitarian intervention or the invocation of the responsibility to protect could be invoked. That doesn't apply on the facts, and moreover, as a matter of law, it's widely understood that Security Council authorization is needed for that kind of intervention, and that was not available. So it clearly was a violation of international law. The more interesting and challenging question is, what can Ukraine do about that? It is doing everything it possibly can. It's bringing a case against Russia in the International Court of Justice, claiming it's doing so under the Genocide Convention, claiming not that Russia is committing genocide, but that Russia falsely accused Ukraine of committing genocide, which is a misinterpretation of the Genocide Convention, and therefore the Court of Justice needs to resolve this dispute over interpretation. In other words, a way of trying to get Russia in court. The International Criminal Court has already indicated it's going to begin an investigation. Neither Ukraine nor Russia are parties to the International Criminal Court, the Rome Statute, but Ukraine has earlier on an ad hoc basis acknowledged that the court had jurisdiction over crimes committed on Ukrainian territory. And that puts the Russians at risk because the crimes are being conceivably committed on Ukrainian territory. The European Court of Human Rights has cases underway. What's going on now can be added to that. And then there are other mechanisms, institutional mechanisms at the UN. Today we heard there was a General Assembly resolution condemning Russia for this violation of international law. You can't get that condemnation in the Security Council because of the veto power. There are all sorts of clever ideas out there about how to undermine Russia's exercise of the veto power, but I don't think any of those will work. In any case, the sort of big picture here is that while there is no international legal mechanism to force Russia to end its intervention, there's certainly enough legal mechanisms to add to the military assistance, the economic sanctions, to force Russia to pay a political and diplomatic cost for this. So if anything, the international legal order is perhaps not alive and well, but I would say not in bed yet. Now with that, I think we've had enough from the speakers. I'm not going to ask follow-up questions. I think it's now time to turn to you. And what we'll do is we'll take a few questions first from the room, and then a few questions from Zoom, and then come back to the room. We do have some microphones, so if you'd like to ask a question, put your hand up and we'll bring the microphones to you. Please identify yourself and make your questions as short and concise as possible. Okay. Got one here. Right there, that's the first hand I saw.
Hi, thank you so much. First of all, absolutely, Ms. Oxana is right. At this time, Fletcher and Tufts should not have any relations, contractual or otherwise with medieval. That being said, right now, a lot of countries are sending defensive weapons into Ukraine. Earlier today, Secretary Lavrov made a somewhat reasonable proposal of deciding that some weapons should not be sent into Ukraine. Is that a good idea, or does that just sound like a way for Russia to further cause or attempt to cause trouble within NATO and EU when it comes to sending defensive weapons to Ukraine? Thank you.
Okay, that's one question. There was a couple of hands here. Stephanie, there was one, yeah, right up front. And then maybe behind, Shira, you can have the next one.
Thank you very much. It's instead of a good, I'm a second year mall student. I want to thank Professor Drezner for bringing up the issue with the food prices. And I was going to say, is the response actually united? Like India abstained today from the UN General Assembly vote. China abstained from the vote. These are huge countries, like Pakistan abstained from the vote. So there are actually many opportunities for Russia to sustain its economic activities. These are huge markets. So I think Russia is going to survive these sanctions. Yeah, the economy is going to be destroyed, but it will be enough for them to survive. So what is the way to for Russia, for the West, let's say, to let Russia face their fate and get out of Ukraine? Or is there any way not losing Ukraine? That's my question.
Mhm.
Thank you very much.
Okay, and then just pass it behind you, Mustafa, Fletcher.
Siri, Vernon, second of all, seeing. I think I actually would like to raise a question to Professor Shattuck, because the U.S. has dealt with war criminals before, especially Richard Holbrooke in the Dayton agreements, and Professor Shattuck was part of that. In those agreements, you could think that Milosevic, he had a way out. He could choose to pull out. And my question is, what is Putin's way out?
Mhm. All right, Stephanie, I'm going to ask first of all Monica and Dan if they want to respond to those questions, and I guess you'll make the same arrangement with John and Oksana. So Monica, Dan, Monica, do you want to take on any of those?
I can start with the first one about Lavrov, Foreign Minister Lavrov today, that he makes a list and we can start negotiating. I actually see it as a positive sign. I mean, this is a dreadful situation, but I was actually quite surprised that last week they were willing to start diplomacy. That tells you that Russia doesn't negotiate, and the fact that they were willing to go to diplomacy so quickly, and now we're having the second round. The diplomacy, John's more of an expert here, it takes time. And for me, at this stage of the game, I'm not saying I'm willing to work with Putin, but what I'm saying is we got to talk to him because we've got to stop the killing. And I feel as if we can get the skilling stopped, get the emotions down, then we can start negotiating the status of Russian forces have been out, get Ukraine stabilized, get the country rebuilt. In terms of the weapon systems themselves, yes, in international relations, there are different kinds of weapon systems. There's weapons that can be used for defense and weapons that can be used for offense. And then you have verification of those systems. We've had treaties before, verification and monitoring evaluation. So I think if it's the case that we could do that fairly, however that's defined, I actually think that that would be a positive thing. And I was glad today to see that Lavrov made that offer. They're talking to us, right? This is a positive step. Whether it goes anywhere, I don't know. I don't have those colored glasses on here, but at least there's some diplomacy going on.
Dan?
Yeah, I'll take the sanctions question, I guess. So I guess two responses. Can Russia survive these sanctions? Yeah, of course they can survive the sanctions. Russia is the largest geographic country on earth, spans 9 time zones. It can absolutely, run an autarkic economy, and it can run a subsistence economy. But this is not what Russians want. And this is particularly not what urban Russians who are, somewhat used to a middle-class lifestyle will be able to do. Your point about India and China is well taken, that they've abstained so far, but that's different from violating the sanctions. And I would suggest strongly that it is highly unlikely that India is going to violate the sanctions. They value the partnership with the United States too much. Not to mention that, again, part of the reason that the US can do all of this is because of the centrality of the dollar to global capital markets. So even if India and Russia do decide they want to trade, short of barter or the Hawala system, they're not going to be able to trade much. So that's not really going to accomplish it. And as for China, that's a somewhat more serious issue. And it's possible that China could decide that they want to, bypass the sanctions. That said, I recall what happened when the U.S. and the European Union imposed sanctions on Iran after 2010. And what China did then was they bought Iranian oil, but they also struck an incredibly hard bargain in buying that oil. They didn't give any hard currency to Iran in return. Instead, they gave it cheap consumer goods, which actually generated a whole bunch of resentment in Iran because cheap Chinese consumer goods are not terribly good. And so it would be, I'm not sure that Russia would get all that much from trading with China. And again, Chinese banks in particular are probably going to obey the sanctions, much as they did in 2014. Now, you could argue that China looks at this and sees a preview of coming attractions if they decide to make a move on Taiwan. And in some ways, that's the really fascinating question. Does China look at this and think, wow, I was not expecting this reaction to Russia. Maybe we need to rethink what we want to do in Taiwan. Or do they think, oh, wow, we now see what the playbook is. So now we can, guard against that when we decide to, move on Taiwan, and we can potentially create an alternative order. That said, I don't think the alternative order would be terribly viable. And there are a lot of reasons why, particularly financially, China can't do what the United States can. So yeah, I want to be very clear. Russia is not going to implode necessarily as an economy. They'll continue to, they can potentially work as a subsistence economy. But, their survival is not necessarily going to be what most Russians want.
Thank you, Dan. Stephanie, do you have Oksana or John on the phone? Okay, so we'll start with John, and then Oksana will come to you and ask if you have comments on any of these questions. John?
I'll try again. Can I be heard?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I think the question, I didn't really hear all of the words that were said, but was about the incentive to negotiate and what might be the off-ramp for Russia. What is the situation of potential negotiations? I think a short answer to this is there is no situation, no ripe situation whatsoever. You need, at the moment, significant incentives. Now, I could imagine incentives, assuming a rational world, that would develop around Russian casualties that are really becoming much severe. I mean, they're already quite serious and they could be more severe. Also, the impact of the sanctions, to be sure. But you need a framework for negotiation. And my experience in the Dayton peace process certainly is where either you get all the parties and then all of the interested international parties who come together. In this case, it would be an extremely complicated framework. It would certainly involve the UN. And as I said earlier, China, I think, has a critical interest in this. But again, none of this is ripe at the moment. And what might be the substance of negotiations down the road? Here again, it's far too early to tell. This is such a fluid situation now. As I said at the beginning of my remarks, we thought what Russia was primarily interested, Putin was interested in here, was Eastern Ukraine, the enclaves. That, of course, was the subject of the 2014 Minsk agreement. That could be opened up again, to be sure. And then, of course, the question of NATO membership, which really isn't his major interest, but nonetheless, as a way of kind of making it clear, he could no longer be pursuing that. So that's an answer. That's about it. And I'm now getting a big echo, so I'll stop.
Thank you, John. Oksana?
Yes, can you all hear me? Yes, okay. I'll just pick up 2 points, one on sanctions and one on the on sanctions impact and one on the negotiations and potential settlement. On the sanctions, I actually don't think that it is absolutely clear that Russia can survive sort of without, much damage or like, you know, in more or less the same political system that it is now? I think we don't know that. I think that is really too early to say. I think the kinds of processes that are being unleashed by the sanctions within Russia, in addition to information, you know, about the casualties, in addition to the isolation, in addition to the impact on the middle class. And I should also mention, I think the fact that people are being bombed are Ukrainians and not the Chechens and not the Syrians. It matters because it's one thing, you know, I mean, we all know the extent of racism in Russia, that the Chechens were considered, you know, maybe not super like us, right? But if this whole narrative that we are liberating these brothers and we are annihilating their children, right? Like once that starts getting in, the borders getting in, I'm not saying that we will see some sort of uprising, but my point was that I don't think we know now, I don't think we can say that, you know, Russia will survive sanctions. There won't be sort of much, it's going to be more or less the same, or people are going to get arrested and that's going to go, you know, as normal. So that's the first point I want to make. Now, on the settlement, of course, you know, everybody's for diplomatic solution, diplomacy is important, but I honestly don't quite see, and this goes to the point, like the question about off-ramp. What is the settlement can look like even hypothetically, right? I think one thing that diplomacy should focus on now is some sort of ceasefire for humanitarian reasons. I think that's the only potentially attainable objective. And even then, you know, Putin perfectly knows what he's doing. He's shelling the people there, they're dying, right? That's the leverage that he's using. So I think the best we can hope for diplomacy is that there would be some break in the shelling that people from these besieged cities can leave. Anything else, I just don't see it. Like what would be the concession? Putin doesn't want Donbass. He doesn't want some sort of Minsk process. The whole point of the Minsk process, and I've written about it with colleagues and people, it was the way to control Ukraine. It was never about, you know, these enclaves being somehow sovereign. Like it was essentially meant to be a Trojan horse within the Ukrainian government that would veto Ukrainian foreign and domestic policies. And that was the objective Putin sought to accomplish, that he's now exactly trying to accomplish by force. So I think we should be very clear-eyed as to what kind of settlement is a possibility. And I think, again, I want to come to this point, and the choices are really stark. I think if Putin gets his way, we are going to have a wasteland in the middle of Europe with hundreds of thousands dead, with probably millions of refugees. And if somebody wants to pretend this is somehow like a buffer state or sort of like everything else around the world can go as normal, I think people should be very clear-eyed that this is what we are going to talk about. Thank you.
We'll take some questions from the Zoom audience, which Eric is going to read out once we get the microphone to him so that everybody can hear the questions.
Great, thank you. So first question from Zoom is anonymous, and it's on Russian nationalism. I think, Monica, this is to you, given that you talked about this. To what extent does Russian nationalism explain its aversion to liberal democracy? And is Russian nationalism an Eastern Orthodox identity, the glue that holds Russia together, or is it something else? Another question from Noah Siegel is there a risk that we could see tactical battlefield nuclear weapons being deployed for the first time? And how do we maintain nuclear deterrence in such a volatile scenario? I think, Sean, you mentioned nuclear weapons. This is to you, but I assume any of the panelists could respond. And then we have one more question about banning access to Russian state media, including RT and Sputnik. Would this be productive, or is it important to maintain free speech and allow for these sources of information to stay in place in the West? This is from Silvio, who says, can't people be trusted to discern what is true and what isn't and formulate an informed opinion?
All right. Thank you, Eric. We'll go, if we can, Stephanie, can we start with Oxana? Can you?
Yes, I was actually reading questions in the chat. Which question do you want me to address? Okay, I take a question from the chat.
Well, there were three. No, there are three questions. You didn't hear the questions, I assume.
No, I didn't hear them very well. No.
Yeah. Well,
can I actually address the question? I think it's an important one. There is one in the chat about the possibility of, you know, some kind of puppet regime after, you know, if Putin succeeds in his campaign. I think that's an important one. So I want to sort of, we all know, I think from the British intelligence reports that were released, that this is indeed seems to be the plan, right? So the idea was that, again, it very well goes with Putin's general misconception about Ukraine, that there are all of these, people who are dissatisfied with Ukrainian government because it's corrupt and whatnot, who ultimately sort of deep down inside real Russian. And if you remove like the bad quote unquote Nazis, right, then you can have some sort of puppet government that would have support. I think that's completely unrealistic. So I think that's another thing. So any sort of plans, be it Yanukovych or Tsarov, or whichever other names were named in the in these reports, how would that work in practice, right? Like who would support this government? Yes, they can raise essentially the country. They can put probably tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people in concentration camps. They can name somebody their puppet government. Like, how does that work exactly? So I think that is not very realistic scenario. So I think this is why all this talk about this is somehow being buffer state and sort of state and like some sort of puppet government, like no, it would be essentially brutal occupation. First of all, second of all, I'm going to say, does Russia have resources for this, right? Those of you who study warfare, urban warfare, I mean, we're talking about imposing hostile government, like government on a hostile population. What manpower does that take, right? I mean, military experts giving different proportions, what it would take to control the city, so forth. Like Russia doesn't now have nearly enough forces committed there or mobilized to do this. Like they would need to do some sort of, martial law and general mobilization. And even then, it is not clear they can actually pacify Ukraine to the extent that this puppet government could even never mind legitimacy, you could even claim that there is some puppet government. I would like to remind historically, as many of you probably know, after the Second World War in Western Ukraine, there was anti-Soviet insurgency well in the 1950s, right? That was the period when Soviet Union was already in the Cold War, when the Western border was closed for the insurgents essentially, because, Poland was, part of the Soviet bloc. They fought against all odds for, almost 10 years. Now, before this invasion, what people would say, oh, but these are like nationalists, quote unquote, Galicians and all the other Ukrainians are, not as nationalists. I'm telling you now, everybody is Bandera, the one that Putin so much fears, right? Like, I'm getting tweets, those of you who, have family and friends in Ukraine, they're talking about a tsunami. I'm going to quote you my Russian-speaking aunt, who's 70-some years old, who's hiding in the basement, outside Kiev. She's saying there is a tsunami of hatred against these orcs. That's her quote tweet from today. She decided not to leave, by the way. She's just worried about getting cat food. Okay, so any kind of plan, I don't mean to criticize the question. I understand that it's a legitimate question, but I just want to emphasize any kind of puppet government run buffer state, just no, you have to live with this. It's either going to be concentration camp with tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dead in the middle of Europe, or Putin will have to fail one way or the other. I think these are the two options that we're looking at. Thank you.
We're going to lose John Shattuck in a few minutes because he's got to go to live TV. John, hopefully we're connected to you and hopefully you heard us. And did you hear the question? There was one about the prospect of actually using tactical nuclear weapons. Did you hear the other questions?
I heard the question about tactical nuclear weapons, and I could see it on the screen here. This is truly uncharted territory and extremely dangerous. And my point before about Biden's principal responsibility now, in addition to all the other aspects of this terrible conflagration here that's being caused by Putin, is to avoid nuclear war. And the risk that Putin could use tactical nuclear weapons is quite great. I do worry about Putin's state of mind and the corner that he's been backed into. So, I don't think this is really a matter of deterrence. The West will not use tactical nuclear weapons. Biden certainly will not. That is off the charts and only as a defensive mechanism. That is to say, in the event that the other side were to use it. But even then, I think that would put us right into the verge of nuclear war. So it's a very, very dangerous thing to consider.
Dan and Monica, do you have any comments on the questions we heard? There was a question about Russian nationalism, the weapons question, and then there was a question about access to state media, banning access to state media. Any comments on any of those from either of you?
Yeah, I could, I mean, so yes, Russian nationalism is real. It's often linked with the Orthodox Church, but interestingly, today, the Orthodox Church said stop, right? So it's not necessarily married all the time. And so it's strong. And then the other thing is the different interpretations. I mean, I started my comments with that Putin has sort of a perverted interpretation that's shared by others, but not shared by the majority of the population. So we want to be clear about that nationalism or nationalisms can be instrumentalized for political purposes, and we're seeing that. But just because it's being instrumentalized doesn't mean that these people don't believe that that's the true interpretation. And so we need to respect that and try to engage them on that. I'm not saying his interpretation is real. I'm saying he thinks it's real. And some other than him believe it's to be real. And therefore we need to try to sort of get our heads around that to deal with that. So yes, Russian nationalism. And then related to the nationalism question is are we going to see a rally around the flag effect, which we usually do see in war? Putin's ratings have been quite low. The economy is stagnating. The people are suffering. It's a winter. It's not a good time to be in many parts of Russia today. And right now, we're not seeing a rally around the flag effect, but it's early days, right? There's a lot of uncertainty. And citizens usually gather around their leaders. They don't want them to be attacked. They don't want the country to be maligned. But, this is we're in unprecedented territory. We're in early days. We have to watch to see what happens.
On Russian state media in the West, I think to some extent the questions are taken by events, because my understanding is RT is pretty much banned, was banned already. As to whether that's the appropriate thing to do, can't people, make decisions for themselves? I'm on the fence here. I mean, I do think, I'm a pretty firm believer in the First Amendment, and so therefore there is an argument to be made for having this kind of debate. On the other hand, the question almost sounds like, well, can't people just do their own research and come to their own conclusions? And let's face it, over the last couple of years, the phrase "do your own research" has not necessarily led to the best outcomes. So I think I am queasily wary of banning RT because I don't like the precedent of it. That said, it is, it's. I don't think I think in some ways it's a moot point. I don't think even if you had RT, available, that people would necessarily be flocking to it.
We're going to lose both John and Oksana in 3 minutes. So if either of you has seen a question in the chat or you want to make a final comment, now would be the time to do it, because I think if I open up to the floor again, we might lose you. And I know you have to leave at 6:55 sharp. So any final thoughts or responses to questions in the chat from either of you?
I can maybe just very quickly mention something about the Orthodox Church, right, and the Orthodox faith. There's actually a very interesting process currently underway in Ukraine that I would be gladly studying if circumstances were better, because I recently began to work on religious politics in Ukraine. As you probably know, there are 2 Orthodox churches in Ukraine, the one affiliated with Moscow and the one that was established as a sole independent church, that Moscow very much opposed. So we now see, exactly because the Patriarch of Russia endorsed this invasion and reunification, quote unquote, of the true Russian lands, there is now a swell of protest within the pro-Moscow church in Ukraine against this. So they already stopped commemorating the Patriarch in the services, and this process continues, including of the most pro-Russian wings of this church. So I think what we might see, again, if we all, if Ukraine survives this whole mess, that we would actually see unification of the 2 Orthodox churches. I think it's a really distinct possibility now. So again, yet again, Putin would serve as a nation builder in Ukraine. It is really ironic, but he had done this, on many questions with regard to NATO, with regard to history, and sort of as a final straw, he may actually do that with regard to the split in the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. So that is something quite ironic. There is an irony there. Thank you. I have to go actually now because I have to get another event. Thank you for holding me.
No. John, not hearing me?
Yeah, I'll just say that nuclear issue is really the most serious that we're discussing here, and it deserves a great deal of attention. But I'm not going to take the time to give it right now. One just hopes that that there is a strong incentive on Putin's part to survive and not to take the whole world down with him. And I think that I believe that's the case. I'm much more worried about the heavy weaponry that he's likely now to use in his attack on Ukraine. So I'll just end at that, and thank you. I'm sorry that, again, it's been a complicated communication process, but I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, John. All right, good. I've had my eyes over here before, so I'm gonna turn my eyes this way. We've got time for at least a couple of questions. So let's, from this side of the room. Yep, start there. Wait for the microphone to come. Right up the third row here.
All right, so I wanted to ask, a couple of days ago, I saw an article that Joe Biden had been presented with a number of cyber-based options of how to respond. And I was wondering what you thought those options might be, and if this could escalate into not a physical war between NATO and Russia, but a cyber war.
Okay, any other questions from around here? Now there's at least one over there. Oh, sorry, Bill. You'll go right to the back, just out of fairness. Right at the very back, yeah.
Hi, Professor Johnstone, Fatma Siddiqui, first year. I think from our class in IOs, my question is regarding the United Nations and Russia's stance on the UN Security Council and what it means moving forward. Just a general question about that, so.
Okay, all right, I'll handle that one. And then now we can come back down here because Bill has had his hand up for a while. All right, we're gonna have to get a quick question, Bill, and then very quick response from everyone.
Hello, thank you. I think Oxana asked a very good question about coming down to how much the West can stomach in terms of how to kind of tailor its responses. And I know this is highly circumstantial, but I was wondering, in your opinion, if we reach a point where we really can't stomach it, what do you think we can do without inheriting too much risk as to have the conflict spill over into other places? Thank you.
Okay. Who wants to go first on any of those? Go ahead, Dan.
So on cyber, that's actually, so first of all, obviously, I wish Professor Wolf was here because she would have a much better answer than I would. But that said, this is one of the more surprising, this is the dog that's not barked so far.
No, the Air Force did.
Well, yeah, that's true. The Air Secretary, but I'm actually legitimately surprised there hasn't been more cyber attacks, and not just in Ukraine, but also, frankly, that would be a natural response to NATO sending weapons into Ukraine. I'm somewhat surprised that there hasn't been an attempt to engage in cyber attacks. Now, that can mean one of two things. The first is that Russia has decided that they don't want to do this because they recognize this could lead to a lateral escalation, which they would then have to deal with cyber response from the United States, and that could then spill over into the actual real war. The other possibility is that Russia has tried to launch cyber attacks and they've failed. Because it's worth remembering that the Biden administration and the European Union have been aware that this has been coming for a couple of months now. And they've been gaming out a variety of scenarios. So it is also possible that in the interim, defensive capabilities have been built up. And so that's where I end with cyber. And I could talk about the other stuff, but
we're gonna have to wrap up.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just in one piece on cyber is, I don't know if you all saw, but anonymous. So we've got private actors now also engaging in a cyber war. And what I would say is the cyber war has been on for a while. Right?
Not to mention the Ukrainians have some cyber capabilities.
Yeah, so I think we're there. But I like Professor Drezner, I'm surprised that it hasn't escalated. And how much the West can stomach, I'm afraid to say a lot. Look what we just went through in Syria. And I'll just end it there.
Russia and the UN Security Council. So the bad news, I guess, is that Russia will not be giving up its seat anytime soon, and it's not going to be possible to take the seat away from Russia anytime soon. But I do think that there's an ongoing crisis of legitimacy of the Security Council. I think this is going to contribute to that sense of crisis. And out of a crisis, sometimes positive things happen, because I think for the members of the Security Council that want it to continue to be a functional institution, they're going to have to start thinking about reform. And that reform is not going to be to kick Russia off, but it may be diluting some of the power of the 5 permanent members and trying to ensure it's more effective in dealing with issues that involve them directly and not only issues involve others. Slightly optimistic possibility there. And, I want to thank our panelists, all of them. Thank you for your questions and for your patience and your perseverance. Sorry about the technological difficulties, but we managed to overcome them. So thank you all.